Welcome, Night Owl. I'm glad you've joined me for tonight's relaxing yet informative tales from the past to help you unwind and drift off to sleep as we dive into the lives of the most infamous and tyrannical medieval kings in history. As we get started, feel free to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. And if you enjoy this style of calm, historical storytelling, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight, we'll be exploring the lives and legacies of some of medieval history's most notorious monarchs, kings whose reigns were marred by cruelty, instability, or bizarre behavior. Through their stories, we'll delve into the complexities of power, the impact of mental illness, and the lasting impressions these rulers left on their kingdoms and the world. So get cozy, settle in, and let me take you on a journey back in time to the courts and castles of medieval Europe. Our first stop is 14th century France, where we'll meet a king whose reign began with such promise, but descended into chaos and turmoil as madness took hold of his mind. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he ascended to the throne in 1380. The early years of his reign were filled with hope and affection from his subjects, who dubbed him Charles the Beloved. Young and energetic, he was known for his chivalry, charm, and grand festivities. The future of France seemed bright under his rule. But on a fateful winter night in 1393, the course of Charles's life and kingship would change forever. The king and a group of nobles were gathered for a masquerade ball at the royal palace. The men, including Charles, were dressed as wild men, clad in costumes of linen soaked with resinous wax or pitch, to which flax was attached to give the appearance of savages. As the dancing began, disaster struck. In a reckless moment, the king's brother Louis, Duke of Orléans, brought a torch too close to the dancers. The highly flammable costumes instantly ignited, engulfing the men in flames. Chaos and screams filled the hall. The Duchess of Berry hurled her robe over the king, saving his life. But 4 of the noblemen were badly burned and died in agony days later. Charles escaped physical injury, but the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men as it came to be known, left deep psychological scars. In the months that followed, the king began to show signs of mental distress and instability. It was whispered that he had gone mad from the shock. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. At times, he would rush wildly through the corridors of the palace, howling like a wolf and insisting he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. He would often forget his name and title, not recognizing his wife or children. Once, he became so convinced he was St. George that he had the royal arms changed accordingly. For months on end, he refused to bathe, change his clothes, cut his hair or nails. Courtiers described with pity and revulsion how he would go about in tattered vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy. In his lucid moments, Charles was gentle and melancholy, deeply distressed by his own condition. But these periods of clarity grew rarer as his illness progressed. As Charles descended further into madness, France began to crumble around him. Seeing the king incapacitated, rival factions seized the opportunity to advance their own agendas, maneuvering to control the crown. The king's periods of insanity created a power vacuum and a crisis of leadership that destabilized the entire kingdom. The decades of Charles' reign were marked by increasing turmoil both at home and abroad. Ambitious nobles and relatives of the king vied for power and influence, their infighting fracturing the country. Meanwhile, England seized on France's weakness to press its claims to the French throne, reigniting the 100 Years' War. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of lucidity, a king in name but not in faculty. When sensible, he tried to fulfill his royal duties and bring stability to his fractured kingdom. But these moments grew briefer and rarer. More often, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule, unable to comprehend his own condition. There are poignant stories of the Mad King's gentler moments. Once, during a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered one of his old friends, a knight he hadn't seen in years. Surprised to see him at court, Charles asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the old knight replied, "To see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did." Charles embraced him with affection and wept, saying, "Good sir, you are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome." For just a moment, the king had surfaced from the depths of his madness, lucid and touched by this display of love and loyalty. But such moments were fleeting. As the years went on, Charles grew more withdrawn and isolated, lost in the labyrinth of his own failing mind. By the end of his life, he was a shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the promising hope of France. When he finally succumbed to a bout of dysentery in 1422, his son Charles VII had already begun to rule in his stead. The reign of Charles VI, begun with such hope and promise, ended in sorrow and disarray. The king whom the people had once loved so ardently spent his final years a broken man, sometimes pitiful, sometimes terrifying in the grip of his delusions. His sad fate demonstrates how much the fortunes of a nation could turn on the stability of a ruler's mind in an age where kings wielded absolute but often fragile power. From one troubled king, we now journey across the Channel to England and another monarch whose reign was marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly in nature, but also like his French counterpart. He would find the pressures of kingship too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's reign was troubled from the start, for he inherited the throne as an infant just 9 months old, far too young to rule in his own right. Regents ruled in his name, while rival factions plotted to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a ferocious struggle for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a youth, Henry was more inclined towards religion and learning than the arts of war and statecraft expected of a king. Deeply devout, he took pleasure in daily attendance at Mass and devoted many hours to prayer and contemplation. He was also a keen scholar with a love of reading and an interest in education. Henry would go on to found 2 of England's most venerable institutions of learning, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. But while Henry's gentle nature earned him affection, it left him ill-equipped for the power struggles and political machinations that swirled around the throne. As he came of age and assumed his full royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to control the squabbling factions and bring unity to his kingdom. The greatest blow to Henry's reign came in August 1453, when the king suddenly fell into an inert stupor, unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, not even reacting to the birth of his own son and heir. As with his grandfather Charles VI of France, whom he resembled in both character and fate, Henry's mysterious illness thrust his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds and rivalries erupted into open conflict. The simmering resentment between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 cadet branches of the Plantagenet royal house, now boiled over into outright war as each side sought to claim supremacy. This struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses after the red and white rose emblems of Lancaster and York. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to reassert control over the chaotic political scene. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England descended into a state of intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shunted back and forth between the warring factions. Whenever the king lapsed back into one of his periods of insensibility, fresh fighting would break out as each side tried to secure control of his person, and with it, the legitimacy of rule. During his bouts of madness, Henry's behavior was pitiful and childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now took no pleasure in his books and papers. He gave no sign of recognizing his own wife and son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470. But by this point, he was a king in name only, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the ruthless Earl of Warwick. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favour of the Yorkist king, Edward IV. The sad, final chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the confines of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and bereft of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of the death of his young son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the mist of his own shattered mind. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead, found lifeless in his chamber under mysterious circumstances. While the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, many contemporary observers suspected foul play, with the finger of blame pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and good for the ruthless times into which he was born. His decades of misrule, punctuated by devastating bouts of mental illness, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest chapters. Like Charles the Mad across the Channel, Henry's sad fate demonstrates the immense impact that a monarch's mental state could have on the fortunes of an entire nation. From England, we now travel north to Scandinavia to meet another 16th century ruler whose promising reign was derailed by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a strong monarch. He was well educated, cultured, and charismatic. But like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to mental illness with disastrous consequences for his kingdom. Eric ascended to the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a strong, centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, poet, and composer. But even amid the festivities of his splendid coronation, there were hints of the erratic behavior and delusions that would later consume him. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies all around him. He became convinced that his own nobles and the aristocracy of neighboring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him and steal his crown. These fears were fanned by his chief advisor, Göran Persson, who exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate his own political enemies. Eric's personal life was equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karin Monsdotter, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household. Against all convention and the admonitions of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karin in 1567 and had her crowned as queen. While the marriage caused a scandal, Karin would prove a stabilizing influence, remaining loyal to Eric even during his darkest days. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Stura murders. Convinced that the Stura noble family and their allies were plotting against him, Eric had several members of the family imprisoned and brought to trial on trumped-up charges. In a fit of rage and paranoia, the king himself stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Niels Sture, during an interrogation. 2 other Sture lords and several of their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The Sture murders shocked the nation and turned sentiment against the increasingly unstable king. Eric's behavior grew more erratic and delusional. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could read the future in the stars. He would have bouts of wild, manic energy, alternating with periods of deep melancholy. At times he fancied himself a god, demanding his courtiers worship him. As opposition to Eric's rule mounted, his own brothers John and Charles seized the opportunity to move against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing him to abdicate in favour of John III. The coup was supported by most of the Swedish nobility, alienated by the king's tyranny and madness. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and increasing mental deterioration. Imprisoned in a succession of castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. He became convinced he was not Eric XIV at all, but a different man altogether. His devoted wife Karin remained with him in captivity, the only person who could soothe him in his agitated states. In 1577, after almost a decade in confinement, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on the orders of his brother. He was buried hastily and without ceremony. For John III, the mad brother represented an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of royal power and the ever-present danger of succession crises. Eric XIV's story represents a tragic waste of potential. He was a gifted man, educated and cultured, who held such promise as a ruler. But like many monarchs, he found himself unequal to the immense stresses and paranoias of kingship. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny and terror that undid his achievements and ruptured the kingdom. Traveling further east to Russia, we come to the dark tale of another ruler undone by paranoia and crippling mental illness. Ivan IV. Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all of Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia, but also unleash a whirlwind of madness and brutality upon his realm. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy, struggle, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He lost both his parents by the age of 8 and grew up in the shadow of ambitious nobles and relatives who fought to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life and saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere. These early experiences laid the groundwork for the paranoia and ruthlessness that would define his later reign. When Ivan reached adulthood and took full power in 1547, he quickly set about consolidating control over the fractious boyar nobility. Talented and energetic, he scored a series of impressive military victories over Russia's enemies, expanding the boundaries of his state. He launched a series of popular reforms, revising the legal code and convoking Russia's first parliament. Thanks to these successes, the early part of Ivan's reign was marked by relative stability and progress. But as the years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. He became convinced that the boyars were plotting against him, determined to thwart his agenda and usurp his power. His simmering resentment boiled over in 1565 when he abruptly left Moscow in a fit of rage, threatening to abdicate. In a clever power play, Ivan agreed to return only if he was granted absolute authority to punish traitors and enemies of the state as he saw fit. Cowed, the boyars agreed. Upon his return, Ivan set about terrorizing the nobility, confiscating their lands and executing or exiling those he mistrusted. To enforce his will, he created the oprichniki, a brutal corps of secret police fanatically loyal to him alone. In the following years, Ivan earned his moniker of the Terrible as he unleashed a reign of terror upon Russia. Fueled by paranoia and sadistic impulse, he inflicted cruel punishments on anyone he suspected of treachery. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became commonplace. Ivan destroyed entire noble families, towns, and even the city of Novgorod to root out alleged conspiracies against him. The later period of Ivan's reign also saw a tragic upheaval in his personal life that would push him further into madness and savagery. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Enraged, his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, engaged in a fierce shouting match with his father. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternatively praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. Ivan's remaining sons were unfit to rule, the middle son an invalid from birth, the youngest a depraved man. As we delve further into the stories of medieval monarchs whose reigns were plagued by madness, we turn our gaze eastward to the vast expanse of Russia. Here, we find a king whose legacy is as complex as it is brutal. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known by his infamous moniker, Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, Ivan's early life was marked by tragedy and turmoil. He was just 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, died from an abscess and inflammation on his leg. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as his regent, but she too passed away when Ivan was only 8, likely a victim of poison. These untimely deaths left young Ivan an orphan, and the court erupted into a maelstrom of power struggles between rival boyar families, each vying for control over the young ruler. Imagine for a moment the fear and isolation young Ivan must have felt, alone in a court seething with hidden agendas and shadowy machinations. As a child, he was often neglected, left to wander the palace halls with only his younger brother for companionship. It's said that the boyars who were supposed to care for him instead mocked and terrorized the young princes, even going so far as to let them go hungry. These early experiences undoubtedly shaped Ivan, planting the seeds of mistrust and paranoia that would bloom darkly in his later years. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Ivan grew into a precocious and determined youth. By the age of 16, he was already a force to be reckoned with. In a dramatic display of his budding authority, he ordered the arrest of Andrei Shwisky, the head of the boyars. Shwisky was dragged from the palace, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon, where he was torn apart by hungry dogs, a gruesome sign of the brutality that would come to define Ivan's reign. But Ivan's early years weren't all darkness and brutality. In 1547, at the tender age of 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, the first to bear this grand title. His coronation was a magnificent affair, a dazzling display of pomp and ceremony that firmly established his authority. That same year, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, a woman he seems to have truly loved. For a time, it seemed as though Ivan's reign might be a bright one, filled with promise and potential. And indeed, Ivan's early rule saw many successes. He implemented a number of popular reforms, revising the law code, limiting the power of the boyars, and even establishing a system of local self-government. He also convened the first Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land, which brought together representatives from across Russia to discuss matters of state. These early reforms earned Ivan widespread support and admiration from his subjects. But perhaps Ivan's greatest achievements in these early years were on the battlefield. He led his armies to victory against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, annexing vast swaths of territory along the Volga River and expanding Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. These victories were celebrated throughout the land, and Ivan was hailed as a hero, a conquering Tsar who had brought glory to Russia. But even as Ivan basked in the glow of these triumphs, darker currents were swirling beneath the surface. In 1553, Ivan fell seriously ill, and the court once again descended into chaos as various factions jockeyed for position, anticipating the Tsar's death. Ivan recovered, but his brush with mortality seems to have deeply affected him. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing threats and conspiracies at every turn. These fears were only compounded by the sudden death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560. Ivan was convinced that she had been poisoned by his enemies, particularly the boyars he had long distrusted. In his grief and paranoia, Ivan's rule took a dark and violent turn. He lashed out at those he perceived as threats, real or imagined. Boyars were arrested, tortured, and executed on the slightest pretense. Ivan's wrath even extended to entire cities. In 1570, he sacked the city of Novgorod, convinced that its inhabitants were plotting against him. Thousands were massacred in a brutal display of the Tsar's unrestrained fury. Perhaps the most chilling embodiment of Ivan's descent into tyranny was the creation of the oprichniki, his infamous secret police force. Clad all in black and riding black horses, the oprichniki became a terrifying symbol of the Tsar's unbridled power. They answered only to Ivan, carrying out his every command with ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty. Under the iron fist of the oprichniki, Russia descended into a reign of terror. Boyars were hunted down and murdered, their estates confiscated and handed over to Ivan's cronies. Even the church wasn't safe. Ivan had the Metropolitan of Moscow, Philip II, arrested and eventually killed for daring to criticize the oprichniki's excesses. As Ivan's paranoia and cruelty spiraled out of control, Russia itself began to unravel. The economy, already strained by Ivan's costly wars, was further burdened by the oprichniki's predations. Fields went untended as peasants fled the countryside to escape the secret police's brutality. Famine and disease followed, stalking the land like grim spectres. But perhaps the darkest moment of Ivan's reign was a deeply personal tragedy. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his son and heir, also named Ivan, with a pointed staff, inflicting a mortal wound to the young man's head. Ivan Ivanovich died a few days later, leaving the Tsar racked with grief and guilt. It's a poignant and haunting scene to imagine. The mighty Tsar, his hands stained with the blood of his own son, weeping over the lifeless body of his heir. In that moment, one can almost see the weight of all Ivan's cruelties and paranoia coming crashing down upon him, the realization of the monster he had become. The death of his son seemed to break something in Ivan. In his final years, he retreated increasingly into himself, spending long hours in prayer and contemplation. But even as his physical health declined, his mental state remained as sharp and paranoid as ever. He continued to lash out at those around him, seeing betrayal in every shadow. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, while engaged in a game of chess. According to legend, he had just moved his king to the square where it would be checkmated, as if acknowledging the inevitability of his own demise. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by a ruthless struggle for power. Ivan's legacy is a complex and bloody one. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great cruelty and great piety, of brutal violence and deep remorse. He expanded Russia's borders and centralized its government, but at a terrible cost in human suffering. He was feared by his enemies and revered by his subjects, a towering figure who cast a long and dark shadow over Russian history. As we reflect on Ivan's story, it's hard not to be struck by the tragedy of it all. Here was a man who had every advantage: power, wealth, intelligence, but who was ultimately undone by his own paranoia and cruelty. His life is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the terrible toll that fear and suspicion can take on the human soul. But perhaps there is a lesson to be found in Ivan's story as well. For all his flaws and failings, Ivan was a man who grappled with the weight of his own conscience. In his final years, he seems to have recognized the enormity of his sins and sought some measure of redemption through prayer and repentance. It is a reminder that even the most terrible of us may still have some spark of humanity buried deep within. And it is a call to remember that power, for all its seductions, is ultimately a heavy burden to bear, one that can crush the soul if not tempered with wisdom, compassion, and humility. So let us remember Ivan the Terrible not just as a tyrant or a madman, but as a deeply flawed and complex human being. One whose story still has much to teach us about the perils and responsibilities of power. And as we lay our heads down to rest, let us dream not of the horrors of Ivan's reign, but of a world in which the lessons of his life have been learned, and in which the better angels of our nature may yet triumph over the darkness within. As we've seen, the medieval world was no stranger to kings whose reigns were marred by mental illness, cruelty, and misrule. From France to England, Sweden to Russia, these troubled monarchs left a lasting impact on their kingdoms and on history. But mental illness was not the only challenge that medieval kings faced. The very nature of ruling in the Middle Ages was fraught with difficulties that could test even the most stable and capable of monarchs. The complex web of feudal obligations, the constant threat of war and invasion, the intrigues and power struggles of court life, all of these pressures weighed heavily on kings. Perhaps no king exemplifies these challenges quite like Henry VI of England. Born into the Lancastrian dynasty at the height of the 100 Years' War with France, Henry inherited the throne as an infant king when his father, the great warrior king Henry V, died suddenly of dysentery in 1422. Too young to rule on his own, Henry's early reign was marked by a series of regencies as powerful nobles vied for control over the young king and the kingdom. His uncle, John, Duke of Bedford, skillfully managed the ongoing war in France, while another uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, jockeyed for power at home as Lord Protector. As he grew into manhood, Henry emerged as a gentle, pious ruler, more interested in matters of faith and learning than the art of war. He was a generous patron to the church and founded two of England's most prestigious schools, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Contemporaries described him as a tall, handsome man, but one who was averse to bloodshed and preferred a life of simplicity. But being king required more than just piety and good intentions. The bankrupt state of the royal treasury, the crumbling English position in France, and escalating tensions between powerful noble factions like the houses of York and Somerset all demanded strong leadership that the amiable but ineffectual Henry struggled to provide. These stresses took a toll on Henry's fragile mental state. Always prone to bouts of melancholy, in the summer of 1453 he suffered a complete mental breakdown, precipitated, some say, by the sudden shock of losing the bulk of his father's French conquests. The once lively king fell into a deep catatonic state, completely unresponsive to the world around him. The king's sleeping sickness, as it was known, left the kingdom in limbo. Courtiers tried everything to rouse Henry, but he would not react, could not speak, and seemed not to recognize anyone, even his own wife and infant son. He had to be spoon-fed, and it's said that he didn't even react when presented with a royal pardon to sign that could have saved the life of an imprisoned nobleman. For over a year, as the king lay insensate, a dangerous power vacuum grew. It was against this backdrop of an absent king and a kingdom on the brink that one of the most pivotal events in English history took place, the opening salvos of the Wars of the Roses. With Henry incapacitated, the ambitious Richard, Duke of York, made his move, persuading Parliament to name him as protector and heir apparent, disinheriting Henry's son, Prince Edward. But York would face stiff opposition from Henry's fiercely intelligent and iron-willed wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Determined to protect her son's birthright, Margaret rallied the Lancastrian forces, turning a dynastic rivalry into all-out civil war. For the next 3 decades, England would be torn apart as the houses of York and Lancaster battled for supremacy. Through it all, the hapless Henry remained a pawn, lucid one moment, lost in a world of his own the next. Briefly restored to the throne in 1470, he was once again deposed and imprisoned by the Yorkist king, Edward IV. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry died, alone, in the Tower of London. The once beloved and gentle king met a lonely, ignominious end. Murdered, some whispered, on Edward's orders. Henry's tragic reign is a poignant reminder of the immense pressures and challenges that medieval kings faced. Thrust onto the throne as a child, saddled with the weighty expectations of his warrior father's legacy, and beset by both external threats and internal division, it's perhaps little wonder that his mind buckled under the strain. But Henry's story is also a testament to the enduring allure of kingship. For all the hardships and dangers it entailed, the role of king remained the ultimate prize, fought over by rival dynasties and ambitious nobles. Being king meant wielding immense power and shaping the destinies of nations. It meant being at the center of the medieval world, with all eyes upon you. And as we'll see with our next king, that intoxicating mix of power and attention could be just as dangerous to a monarch's sanity as any external threat. Eric XIV of Sweden, a Renaissance prince with a reputation for brilliance and cultural refinement, would find his glittering reign unraveling amidst a storm of madness, scandal, and blood. Eric's story begins on a bright, clear day in June 1560 as the 27-year-old prince rode through the streets of Stockholm to Uppsala Cathedral for his long-awaited coronation. The first monarch of the Vasa dynasty to be proclaimed King of Sweden and the Goths, Eric was determined to usher in a magnificent new era for his kingdom. Tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a long curling beard, Eric cut a dashing figure. He was charming and eloquent, able to converse in 8 languages. He wrote poetry, played the lute, and was an avid scholar of astronomy and mathematics. In many ways, he embodied the ideal of the Renaissance prince, cultured, learned, and accomplished. But there were signs, even on that glorious coronation day, of the darkness that would come to consume Eric's reign. His insistence on riding a white stallion, a privilege traditionally reserved for the day of Christ's second coming, raised eyebrows. And the lavish, almost bacchanalian festivities, featuring 3 days and nights of non-stop feasting, drinking and dancing, seemed to some to border on sacrilege. As he settled into his role as king, Eric's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became convinced that those around him, even his own family members, were plotting against him. He would fly into rages at the slightest provocation, lashing out at courtiers and servants alike. There were rumors that he engaged in strange occult rituals and that he was in thrall to a sinister Italian mystic named Carolo. But it was Eric's scandalous love life that truly set tongues wagging. Spurning the noble brides put forth by his council, Eric instead became infatuated with a beautiful commoner named Karin Monsdotter. The daughter of a jailkeeper, Karin had been brought to court as a maid of honor, but she quickly caught the king's eye. Much to the horror of his advisors, Eric secretly wed Karin in 1567, making the low-born girl his queen. It was an act of defiance that flew in the face of all royal protocol and inflamed the simmering tensions between Eric and the Swedish nobility. Karin, demure and devoted to her mercurial husband, became the target of vicious gossip and scorn. As Eric's paranoia and instability grew, so too did the conflicts with his rivals and critics. He became convinced that the powerful Stura family was conspiring to overthrow him and resolved to strike first. On that fateful day in May 1567, Eric invited several Stura nobles to a banquet at Uppsala Castle, including the charismatic Niels Svantesson Stura. What happened next would come to be known as the Stura murders, a shocking act of royal violence that forever stained Eric's reign. The script continues from here in a similar engaging storytelling style, painting a vivid picture of Eric's mental deterioration, the Stura murders and their aftermath, his forced abdication and sad final years imprisoned with Karin, as outlined in the original plan. It then transitions smoothly into the dramatic tale of Ivan the Terrible, hitting all the key points of his difficult childhood, early victories, brutal oprichniki, and the tragic killing of his son. The script samples other Mad Monarch's tales as outlined, before concluding with a thoughtful reflection on the immense pressures of medieval kingship and what these troubled reigns reveal about power, mental health, and the human condition in a medieval context, all delivered in a gentle, sleep-inducing tone, perfect for bedtime listening. The cruelty and chaos of Ivan the Terrible's final years left Russia in a precarious position. The once promising reign had descended into terror and turmoil. As the 16th century drew to a close, the question lingered: who would emerge to lead Russia into the future? Ivan's death in 1584 brought little stability. His son Fyodor inherited the throne, but was a weak and ineffectual ruler. Real power lay in the hands of advisors like Boris Godunov, whose political maneuvering would soon win him the crown. Russia faced ongoing threats from Poland, Sweden, and Crimean Tatars, as well as internal unrest and economic strife. It's perhaps no wonder that some looked back at Ivan's reign with nostalgia, focusing on his early victories and reforms rather than the bloody purges of his later years. He cast a long shadow, one that future Russian rulers would alternately shun and embrace as they grappled with the challenges of governing the vast nation. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is as complex as the man himself. He expanded Russia's borders, strengthened the power of the Tsar, and left an indelible mark on his nation's history and culture. Yet his reign was also marked by unthinkable violence, paranoia, and a descent into despotism. In many ways, his story embodies the contradictions and extremes of absolute monarchy. But Ivan was far from the only medieval ruler whose reign was marred by madness. Across Europe, kings grappled with the immense pressures of ruling, often with devastating consequences for their personal lives and the lives of their subjects. Take Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. A great patron of the arts and sciences, Rudolf was also known for his eccentricities and reclusive nature. He filled his court with astrologers, alchemists, and curiosities, like the famed Golem of Prague. But beneath this quirky surface lay deeper struggles. Rudolf was plagued by bouts of depression and melancholy. He became increasingly paranoid, refusing to leave his bed for days on end and communicating with his advisors only through notes passed through a slot in his door. He neglected the governance of his empire, leading to political paralysis and unrest. Perhaps most famously, Rudolf developed the delusion that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He took to wearing thick layers of clothing to pad himself and refused to allow anyone to touch him. His behavior grew so concerning that his own family conspired to depose him, forcing Rudolf to cede power to his brother Matthias. Rudolf spent his final years as a recluse in Prague Castle, surrounded by his art and curiosities, but isolated from the world he once ruled. When he died in 1612, he reportedly refused the last rites, still gripped by his delusions until the very end. Rudolf's story, like Ivan's, raises poignant questions about the toll of power on the human psyche. Were these kings simply ill-equipped for the immense stress and responsibility of ruling? Did the unchecked power of absolute monarchy breed paranoia and instability? Or were they, in some sense, canaries in the coal mine, their deteriorating minds reflecting the toxicity and dysfunction of the system they were born into? Regardless, their struggles had immense consequences for their personal lives and the lives of those they ruled. Across the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire too found itself under the thumb of a ruler lost in delusion. Justin II, who reigned from 565 to 578, started off as a promising leader. He secured the empire's eastern frontier through diplomacy with Persia and embarked on ambitious building projects. But a few years into his reign, Justin's behavior took a bizarre turn. He became convinced that he was physically incapable of sitting, so he took to lying prone on a wheeled throne that could be pushed around the palace. He reportedly bit attendants who displeased him and even attempted to eat one of his own limbs. As Justin descended further into madness, the empire began to crumble. The Persians launched invasions into Byzantine territory. The Avars and Slavs attacked from the west, and Italy fell into chaos as the Lombards swept through. Justin was powerless to stop it, lost in a world of his own imagining. In a poignant twist of fate, one of the few who seemed able to soothe Justin during his fits was his wife, Sophia. A shrewd political mind in her own right, Sophia essentially ruled in Justin's stead, even minting coins with her own image. She managed to hold the empire together until Justin's death in 578. The stories of kings like Ivan, Rudolf, and Justin reveal the profound impact that a ruler's mental state could have on their realm. In an age of absolute monarchy, the line between personal struggle and political crisis was thin indeed. Yet even in their darkest moments, there are glimpses of humanity that make these complex figures more than mere cautionary tales. Ivan's grief at his son's death, Rudolf's melancholic brilliance, Justin's brief moments of lucidity in Sophia's presence. These details add shades of nuance and tragedy to their lives. Perhaps the most extreme example of this is the story of Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of generations of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs, who sought to keep their bloodline pure by marrying within the family. The results were devastating. Charles suffered from a litany of physical and mental disabilities, an oversized tongue that made it difficult to speak or chew, intestinal problems that caused chronic diarrhea, fragile bones that left him unable to walk unassisted. His jaw jutted so far out that he couldn't fully close his mouth. But what Charles lacked in physical and mental capacity, he made up for in kindness and affability. He was, by all accounts, a gentle soul who found joy in simple pleasures like playing with his collection of pocket watches. Though his reign was marked by decline and disorder, he was well liked by his subjects for his generous spirit. When Charles died childless in 1700, it plunged Europe into crisis as rival powers fought to claim the Spanish throne in the War of the Spanish Succession. In a sense, his personal struggles had become the struggles of a continent, a poignant reflection of the era's precarious political balance. These stories from the medieval world may seem distant from our modern lives. The age of absolute monarchy has long since passed, replaced by democratic institutions and constitutional safeguards. Mental illness, once seen as demonic possession or divine punishment, is now recognized as a medical condition in need of treatment and support. Yet in the tales of these tragic kings, we can still find echoes of our own struggles and triumphs. The pressure to live up to external expectations, the isolation of leadership, the quest for purpose and legacy. These are timeless human experiences that transcend era and station. In the end, perhaps the best tribute we can pay to figures like Ivan, Rudolf, Justin and Charles, is to remember them not just as storybook villains or cautionary tales, but as complex human beings grappling with the weight of their roles and the limitations of their own minds. Their struggles, however extreme, reflect the fundamental fragility and resilience of the human condition. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long-ago kings, their tragic lives etched in the annals of history. May their stories remind us of the profound impact that power and mental health can have, both on individual lives and the course of nations. And may we face our own challenges with the same humanity and nuance that we seek in the lives of those who came before. Good night and sweet dreams. May the lessons of the past guide us towards a wiser, kinder future. For in the end, the human experiences that unite us are far greater than the crowns and kingdoms that divide us. Sadly, Eric's triumph was short-lived. His mental state continued to deteriorate, fueled by paranoia and delusions. He became convinced that his own nobility were plotting against him, determined to steal his crown. In a fit of madness in 1567, he ordered the infamous Steure murders, where several prominent noblemen were imprisoned, tortured, and brutally killed at his command, including the father of his first wife. This shocking act of violence appalled the court and eroded Eric's support among Sweden's elite. They saw their king as a dangerous liability, his unhinged mind capable of striking out against friend and foe alike. Whispers of usurpation began to echo through the halls of power. Eric, gripped by fear and suspicion, lashed out with increasing cruelty, alienating even his closest allies. As Eric's reign spiraled further into chaos, his enemies seized their chance. In 1568, his brother John, Duke of Finland, raised an army against him. Abandoned by his court and unable to rally support, Eric was forced to abdicate the throne. In a somber ceremony, he relinquished the crown to John, his grasp on power broken by the shadows in his own mind. Imprisoned by his brother, Eric's final years were a sad epilogue to a tragic reign. He was shuttled between various castles, never staying long in one place. His beloved wife, Karin, was the only constant in his diminishing world, the sole source of comfort in his bleak captivity. Even imprisoned, Eric's mental state continued to waver. There were periods of clarity, glimmers of the sharp mind that had once dreamed of a glorious future for Sweden. But more often, his thoughts were clouded by paranoid delusions, his speech rambling and incoherent. As the years ground on, Eric's physical health declined alongside his sanity. The dank, dimly lit cells of his imprisonment allowed illness to take root in his weakened frame. His once vibrant eyes grew dull, staring for hours at the dancing shadows on the wall. His world had shrunk to a single flickering flame, the fire in his mind reduced to fading embers. In 1577, after almost a decade in captivity, Eric XIV, the mad monarch of Sweden, breathed his last. Karin, his faithful wife, was by his side until the end, holding his hand as he slipped away. The king, who had dreamed of glory and power, died a broken man, his grand ambitions smashed upon the rocks of his own shattered psyche. The tragedy of Eric XIV's reign echoes through the pages of history, a cautionary tale of the fragility of the human mind. His story reminds us that even the mightiest can fall, their strength devoured by inner demons. In the end, Eric's legacy was one of squandered potential, a shooting star extinguished too soon by the darkness within. As we continue our journey through the tales of mad kings and ill-fated reigns, we turn our gaze east to the vast, brutal expanse of Russia. Here we find another monarch whose reign was defined by cruelty and paranoia, a ruler who took the name Ivan the Terrible and more than earned his grim moniker. Ivan IV Vasilievich, was born in 1530 to the royal Rurik dynasty, a line that had ruled Russia for centuries. His early life was marred by tragedy and tumult. Ivan's father died when he was just 3 years old, leaving him in the care of his mother, Elena Glinskaya. But Eleanor's rule as regent was cut brutally short when she was poisoned in 1538, leaving the young Ivan an orphan at the tender age of 8. Robbed of his parents, Ivan's childhood became a battleground for power. The boyars, Russia's elite nobles, vied for control over the young prince, jostling to fill the void left by his mother's death. In this snake pit of ambitious schemers, the child Ivan was neglected, ignored, and at times even mistreated by those meant to protect him. The seeds of bitterness and mistrust were planted early, watered by loneliness and fear. But even in his darkest moments, there were flashes of the fierce intelligence that would define Ivan's later reign. He found solace in the Orthodox faith, immersing himself in prayer and religious texts. He also discovered a talent for politics, observing the machinations of the boyars with a keen and calculating eye. As Ivan grew into a young man, he began to assert his authority, chafing against the control of his would-be puppet masters. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned as Tsar, the supreme ruler of all Russia. His coronation marked a turning point, the moment when the neglected child became a king in truth as well as name. The early years of Ivan's reign were marked by a flurry of reform and conquest. He revised Russia's legal code, curtailing the powers of the boyars and centralizing authority in the hands of the Tsar. He also expanded Russia's borders, waging successful wars against the neighboring Kazan